Good morning to those of you who have joined us in the room, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon to those of you who have joined us online. My name is Zara Balluri, and I have the privilege of being the moderator for this session today on diverse voices and representation for stronger systems. I work for the Water for Women Fund. If you haven't heard about the Water for Women Fund and its partners, it's a DFAT, an Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade funded program, largely in Asia Pacific, involving research and on-the-ground, locally implemented projects in support of climate-resilient, inclusive WASH. It particularly supports projects that challenge the status quo to shift away from harmful norms and bring about more equality and systems change. Today we have an excellent panel of partners and friends from Asia Pacific speaking about diverse voices and representation for stronger WASH systems. I'll just go through these panellists very quickly. We have Fraser Goff from WaterAid Australia, Rana Abdel Sattar from IDE Cambodia, Ruhil Iyer from SLH, Bangladesh, Dr. Malika Sobhi from Fiji, Tema Wickham from Plan, Solomon Islands, Michelle Hobbs from Griffith University, Australia, and Phil Duncan from the University of Canberra. We also have with us Lou Ellen, who is the Director of Urban and International Water and Resources from the Australian Government. So without further ado, I'll hand over to my co-online moderator, Fraser Goff, who will go through the approach to systems strengthening. Over to you, Fraser.
Very much, Sarah. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'd like to begin my part of today's presentation by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land I'm calling in from in Naarm, Melbourne, and I pay my respect to their elders, past and present. Wurundjeri sovereignty has never been ceded. I also pay my respect to all First Nations people joining our session today, both in the room and online. Next slide, please. To help set the scene today, I'm pleased to share with you some lessons from a learning agenda initiative we held over the past 5 years as part of Water for Women, to explore the contributions of civil society and research organisations to strengthening WASH systems for greater inclusion and sustainability. The learning agenda brought together diverse voices, diverse organisations and diverse approaches across 15 countries in the Asia Pacific region, and has resulted in a series of learning notes that I hope you'll read after today's session. Our first step in the learning agenda was to consider what we mean when we talk about the WASH system, which I'm sure you will hear many people mentioning throughout the course of this week. One shared framing that enabled us to bring lessons from our experiences together was to think about the WASH system as a network of people and institutions. Previous slide, please. When we consider the systems are made up of people, we cannot ignore the dimensions of power, capacity, and the prevailing norms and mindsets which influence how people collaborate together. The conscious and unconscious biases that individual people bring to their work in water and WASH are shaped by the social norms and culture of the society we live in. These norms privilege certain groups while limiting the participation, agency, and voice of other groups at the decision-making table. Next slide. In systems thinking and also within social norms discussions, people sometimes refer to the iceberg model. When we observe how the system works, those visible events, behaviours and practices of people within the system are shaped by invisible norms, beliefs, values and attitudes. Next slide. So what have Water for Women partners learned about the WASH systems and WASH systems strengthening over the past 5 years? We have learned that diverse systems are strong systems. Shifting power so that diverse people have power to contribute and building collaborative power with people that experience marginalisation leads to more equitable WASH services as well as stronger and more resilient planning and decision-making structures. Building relationships between actors with the formal mandate for WASH services and other actors such as gender, equity, disability and social inclusion actors, actors from climate change and climate experts, rights holder organisations, and Indigenous knowledge holders has numerous benefits. Such relationships and collaboration can improve the representation of diverse groups and the knowledge which goes into decision-making. You will hear examples today of how valuing knowledge of First Nations women and men can improve ecological and social health. Diverse actors have complementary capacities. The facilitation skills and social knowledge of rights holders and grassroots advocates can complement the technical knowledge of water engineers and policymakers. Diversity and representation can also help surface and address cross-sectoral issues. We know that many of the barriers to effective and sustainable WASH originate beyond the WASH sector in systems for finance, governance, and environmental policy, requiring collaboration for greater influence. And finally, each person and organisation brings their own network, which represent pathways through which change can be influenced. Next slide, please. Through Water for Women's Learning Agenda initiative, we have been discussing 3 levels at which systems change can and should happen. I hope this framing might be useful as you listen to our panelists today. Firstly, structural changes involve changing policies, practices, and flows of information and resources. You will hear an example today from Michelle about what happens when policies are made which do not involve diverse perspectives and the ecological and cultural impact this can have on rivers and people with spiritual and cultural connections to them. You will also hear from Tema about how Plan International have used photo voice in the Solomon Islands, strengthen community members' participation in WASH planning, which in turn is influencing the planning practices of government actors. The second level of change we've been discussing has been relational and political changes, those which create new partnerships and shift power over decision-making and accountability. Today, you'll hear an example from Rana about how improving the relationships between women entrepreneurs and women government leaders is catalysing change in sanitation markets in Cambodia. You will also hear an example from Ruhil about how intersectionality of social norms and disadvantage in Bangladesh shapes different people's experience of climate change impact and the ways that participatory processes can lead to better decision-making and community action planning. The third level at which systems change can and should happen are mental and attitudinal changes, those which reshape people's beliefs and assumptions and can lead to social norms change, transformational and compassionate leadership. Malika will share about how the involvement of women in water committees in Fiji is shifting power and engaging both women and men in the deep thinking required to change gender norms. We also know that these attitudinal changes must start from within ourselves and our organisation, and we will hear some reflections from Phil about what this means for him. Hopefully, in today's panel examples, you will hear that when we address change at all 3 levels, we can have lasting and meaningful impact in WASH systems and services. One additional concept which may be useful as you engage in our session today is about how social norms change happens. From the Water for Women initiatives, we have been exploring how shifting norms within and beyond WASH requires us to scale up, change the laws and policies which hold harmful norms in place. Next slide, please. We need to scale out to engage others in dialogue about the harmful norms and the empowering norms that exist around us. And underpinning both of these changes, we need to scale deep, investing in the intentional work and thought required to engage hearts and minds, including our own. Next slide, please. Finally, we wanted to share a few practical lessons from Water for Women for those of you who are engaging with water and WASH systems. Firstly, context is key. We need to understand and tailor our programs to their contexts and the people who are or who should be represented in local WASH systems. Secondly, we should strive to achieve change at all three levels, structural, relational, and normative, in order to achieve meaningful inclusion which can be sustained beyond our interventions. Diverse collaborations are one good way to do this, bringing diverse actors to work together on an activity such as community mapping and planning, data collection, or research. Another useful way of achieving this can be through establishing feedback loops, opportunities for community to hold those with formal authority to account, and excellent opportunities to surface and challenge harmful norms and practices while strengthening diverse community voices. Finally, we have been learning that if we want to demonstrate, we must demonstrate inclusive and participatory practice in our own work, if we are hoping to influence this practice in others. We should build shared ownership of our program goals through meaningful partnerships. We should generate and share evidence from our programs so that others can use it for their own advocacy and influencing. And most importantly, we must design our interventions to do no harm. We must identify the ways in which our own practices, our roles in the system, contribute to perpetuating harmful norms or preventing diverse representation. And we must act to begin transformative change from within ourselves and our organisations. With that scene setting, I'm pleased to now hand over to Rana, the first of our panelists, who will share some examples from Cambodia. Over to you, Rana.
Thanks, Fraser. Hello, everyone. Wish we were there in person with you. So could we please share the screen? Okay, excellent. All right. So today I'll be sharing some of the ways that IDE has been working to strengthen the leadership of women in the public and private sector to achieve a more inclusive, resilient WASH market system. Next slide, please. So in the past decade, Cambodia has been able to increase its basic sanitation coverage across the rural areas. However, there are still some limitations and challenges. There aren't many WASH affordable solutions in climate vulnerable areas. For example, in flood-prone areas, communities that are bordering the main lake, the Tonle Sap Lake. And also there is across all of Cambodia a limited access to safely managed sanitation services, which puts a great threat to water and other natural resources as climate changes. In addition, even though women are present in the WASH market system, they're still not present in an equal manner, and they have limited ownership, decision-making power, and resources, both from the public and private sector side of the WASH market system. Next slide, please. So starting off with the private sector, one of our key partners in the WASH market system, IDE has been working to improve gender equality within the private sector by providing gender transformative capacity building. So what does that entail? First, we're partnering with GEDSI experts who are local in the context. For example, Sheet Investments is one of our partners, to conduct workshops that engage both men and women entrepreneurs, but yet focus on creating an enabling environment for gender equality and empowering women to become leaders. So far, we've had 73 entrepreneurs who've completed this workshop, 35 of which were women. This training includes some key topics and has the goal to improve women's financial, business, problem-solving skills and confidence, facilitating networks between the entrepreneurs, the community, and the local authorities to create a more sustainable system, transforming gender norms concepts, creating female role models in the community, and supporting, again, men to create an enabling environment for women to achieve these goals. In addition to supporting the businesses, we are also providing those same businesses with On the technical side of things, training to produce, manufacture, install inclusive and resilient WASH products and services across Cambodia. So that includes disability-friendly shelters, toilet shelters, as well as climate-resilient technologies in those flood-prone areas and high groundwater areas of rural Cambodia. In addition to that, supporting them to create payment installment plan and other types of subsidies that can also leave no one behind through these services and products. IDEA has always also been working with and looking at their own staff who are working very closely with those entrepreneurs. They're meeting with them on a very regular basis, about once a week. So by them being trained also to be more gender sensitive in their weekly engagement and coaching to the LBOs, we've seen that that also is a key intervention. So before I move on to the public sector side of things, I'd like to leave you with a quote here from one of our entrepreneurs. "I could not believe that I could go this far. I am content with my business as I can provide products and services that are essential for everyone's health and well-being. Equally important, I can challenge myself and prove that women can manage their businesses all by themselves." So that kind of shows that transformative vision that some of the women entrepreneurs are seeing. Next slide, please. So from the public sector, Cambodia currently assigns 1 female local authorities at each of the district and commune level that have the mandate of facilitating improved WASH and other public health services to the communities. However, these women are under-resourced. So IDE's intervention has been specifically to work with these women to accelerate progress towards open defecation free, which is a national goal. So also aligning with that goal. And the key way of the way of doing that intervention by doing a training of trainers is kind of the key way of how we believe it has a higher impact. So including having the women local authorities getting the training, but also realizing that as part of their next steps as well, providing them with the resources and the material to be able to disseminate these messages to the community themselves. So some of the topics that are included in those workshops is open defecation-free sustainability, so how to maintain it over time, hand washing, safe infant fecal disposal, menstrual hygiene, and safely managed sanitation. So far, we've been able to train 128 female local entrepreneurs who then conducted that training themselves to village level local authorities as well as communities to promote WASH behavior change messaging to about 3,400 community members. As we look forward into the future and we continue doing these activities, we're adding a layer of climate resilience and messages. For example, how households opening their pits or piecing the pits may mean also open defecation. So it's not just not owning a toilet, but also not safely managing a toilet. And increasing access to safely managed sanitation as a way to reduce unsafe household practices of opening their pits or piercing their pits and polluting the environment, which will just make them more susceptible to impacts of climate disasters. So one more key aspect that IDE has been able to do is to increase climate awareness and mapping climate challenging areas for in the village level. So improving kind of the DRR, what are the WASH actions before, during, and after a climate shock? I'll leave you now here with a quote from a district level DWC, local authority. She says, "We started collecting information about the number of toilets used by people. We realized from the data that the number of people who own toilets was very low, only for about 40%. We were surprised how low that number was. Once we had this data," she said, "okay, this is an issue that we need to address really soon. That is when we started working with the Commune Council and prioritized WASH into the 3-year plan. So you can see some structural level system change as well from that response. Next slide, please. All right, here I'm just going to be sharing some of those key messages and call to actions to consider. Us as CSOs, we should, and a key stakeholder in those WASH systems, at least to start them and introduce them, we should start with ourselves by increasing gender equality, disability, and social inclusion of our own staff, especially if those staffs are working directly with the community. Also, in the context where strong gender norms still exist, engaging men, we feel, is kind of a necessary point for creating enabling environments for women to thrive. Increasing gender equality and confidence in decision-making for women entrepreneurs and equipping them with the tools to serve their communities is a way to ensure that there's leaving no one behind through these WASH systems. And finally, by conducting a training to trainer types of activities to local authorities, they can then fulfill their role in the WASH sector, helping to strengthen equitable, universal access to resilient sanitation systems. Next slide. Thank you so much. Looking forward to answer any of your questions later on. Thanks, Fraser.
Thanks, Rana.
Fraser. We might now quickly move to Ruhil, and she will give an example of climate impacts on rural sanitation hygiene in Bangladesh. And then we will hear from Dr. Malika Sobhi, and then we'll open it up for hard-hitting questions and comments from the audience. So thank you. Over to you, Ruhil.
Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Ruhil. I'm a researcher at the Institute of Development Studies in the UK, in England. And I work on a project called the Sanitation Learning Hub. So today I'm going to be speaking to you about some of the work we've done on participatory vulnerability, climate and sanitation related analyses to understand and respond to climate shocks and stresses. We undertook this work with WaterAid Bangladesh and Rupantor in Bangladesh, and they led this work in country. We worked across 9 wards in one union called Krishnanagar in the Satkhira district. And just to paint a picture, this district is on the southwest coastal belt of Bangladesh, and it is the entire sort of geographical topography is all mangroves. And it's in the mangrove belt that extends from India all across the south of Bangladesh. Next slide, please. So we undertook a series of participatory consultations. This involved multiple different methods, but they included social mappings, they included seasonal calendars, and they included a series of focus group discussions with different people across men and women. With women, we had specific discussions around menstrual hygiene management as well. And at the end of it, we undertook a sort of problem priority analysis across these wards to understand where people would rank all of their issues. All of this information was then collected in all of these maps that you're seeing on the screen and fed into individual ward development plans. These plans were then taken for validation at multiple different levels. So they were validated at the ward level with leaders at the ward level. Then we went to the sub-district level and then the district level. So all union level and then sub-district level. So all leaders at these multiple levels were introduced to these problems, as well as the potential solutions and the ideas that people themselves had come up with to address a lot of the problems that they were facing within the ward. Next slide, please. In terms of the specific problems, and the findings, what we found in terms of how climate was interacting with a lot of the sanitation problems that people had in the ward. The impacts themselves were frequent and intense cyclones and storm surges, along with the change in seasonal patterns. It also was leading to increased saline water intrusion within their mangroves. And seawater was intruding and therefore making the water more saline. In terms of the indirect effects, the salinity of the water affected their water quality that was available across the ward. The frequent storm surges led to reduced prioritization within sanitation and hygiene because they saw a lot of damage to their household infrastructure, to their crops, to their farming, and to their cattle. So they were less inclined to invest in sort of fixing up their sanitation and hygiene infrastructure when it got damaged. These frequent storm surges, in terms of direct impacts, would lead to their latrines breaking down, their pits collapsing. It would lead to fecal sludge collecting within their household environments and around their homes because of these collapsing pits. The pits also filled up really quickly, which made them need to either dig more pits or invest way more in desludging. The reduced access to markets and resources was also a function of these climatic surges and the storm surges because the paths would get muddy and they couldn't walk and traverse through these paths to get to markets and resources. This had a big impact on menstrual hygiene management for women because they would not have access to certain materials to take care of their menstrual hygiene and manage that safely when these big events would occur. Because of the saline water and one of the occupations being shrimp farming, women would have to essentially farm hip deep in saline water for up to 8 to 9 hours. This caused a series of issues with gynecological issues with rashes and urinary tract infections, and it caused a lot of pain while managing their menstrual hygiene. So it was not something that women could speak about very freely. It took a lot for us to speak to them in the focus group discussions about this. And they found that because with the increasing salinity of the water, their problems were starting to get worse. I have 2 quotes on the screen, which I might pause and let you read before I move on. Just to wind up my presentation now, as I said, a lot of this information was fed into the ward development plans and taken and validated at multiple tiers. It is also fed into WaterAid's expanding program in this region, so they're hoping to use this into their own next sort of 5-year strategy in the area. And a lot of this work and the methods of the vulnerability analysis through participatory methods is also now being scaled out to different wards and unions across Bangladesh. So thank you very much.
Bulbinaka, everyone. That greeting should cover all time zones, so I'm going to go straight on to my presentation. I'm co-presenting with Sakimi Alfred, who actually did the training, the WASH training on the ground for this, and I will be comparing, hang on. Yeah. WASH training that happened in in one community in Fiji. There's something that happened. Yeah. Okay. All right. So the training happened of an evening. You can see it's dark outside. I'll come back to that because that's actually quite an important point when you're doing training in Fijian communities, especially for women. Next slide, please. So the next slide, for those of you that don't know where I'm from, Fiji is in the Pacific, South Pacific. Our most famous export right now is Fiji water, bottled water that goes to some of the very expensive locations abroad. And I live in the city of Suva that you can see there on Vitilevu. Those are just some of the basic statistics of our country. We haven't reached 1 million people yet. We're a small country, 18,000 square kilometers, and most of the population is on the 2 main islands. And so I live in the capital city of Suva. Next slide, please. So the two communities that I'm going to contrast this morning is one that's in the maritime zone, Nadula Island, and one that is on the mainland, Lawai, which is actually my village. And the reason why I decided to go with comparing and contrasting Nadula with my village is part of a personal journey for me. Because I've lived in Suva for a long time, it was really important for me to go back and see, well, what progress have we made in terms of WASH in my village. And you can see that the geology will influence the water sources because Nadula is in the maritime zone. They are dependent solely on groundwater and rainwater, whereas my village, Lawai, is next to a big river system. Next slide, please. So the training in Nadula was carried out by Habitat for Humanity, and it although some of the activities included everyone at the start, they broke up into men's group, women's group, and a youth group at the end. And you may wonder why. Well, it was actually to encourage a free exchange of ideas. Because of the vanua, which I will talk about, sometimes women aren't so, they're reticent to speak up when there's men in the room. And so what I'd like to do is just to dwell a bit on that first bullet point where you need to include the government, the vanua, and the church with any of these training activities in Fijian communities. Government, because it gives you credibility. In this instance, we had the Ministry of Itoke Affairs that looks after the indigenous people. We had the Ministry of Health because of WASH training, and we had the Ministry of Education. The vanua. What do we mean by vanua? Vanua is a concept, in Fijian it means land. But it's actually an all-encompassing term. Vanua includes land, water, whether it's fresh water or coastal, depending on the village location. It includes flora, it includes fauna, and it includes the traditions and the values of that particular social group. Now, vanua is a common concept throughout the Pacific. The Maori call it whenua. In Tonga, it's called whanua. In Samoan, it's called whanua, but it's really an all-encompassing term. Now, the vanua plays a huge role in the perceptions that people have, particularly because it's a patriarchal system. One of the biggest challenges in this training was getting the men to realize that women were actually using water a lot, but that women could also play a big role in the management and also in looking after the infrastructure of the water or the WASH system in the village. So that influence of vanua cannot be underestimated. It really does play a big role in how things work out in the village. And then there's the gendered roles. Women are the movers and shakers in Fijian villages. They do everything from washing, cleaning, cooking, looking after the children, going to collect firewood, going to get produce from the garden. So when you do training with women, one of the things that you need to be mindful of is you do it at the end of the day for a lot of them, because that's when all their domestic chores are done with. That's a practical consideration. Church, huge role in Fijian communities. We got the youth group involved because they could then do the Sunday schools and promote, cleanliness, being next to godliness. So if you can quote from the Bible, that, you're on a winning run. Next slide, please. So the training, what did it achieve? You can see some of the bullet points there. Water committees are present, or are supposed to be present, in all rural villages, and this is a requirement of the Water Authority of Fiji. Water committees look after the infrastructure in the village. Up until this training, most of the water committee was made up of men. After this training, the participation of women went up to 30% from 10%. And the reason being was just the change in mindset. And they no longer were just the secretary of these committees, but they became part of the management. They took the lead on these committees. And it's not just the water committee, you've the health committee, you've got the development committee. There's quite a structure in these villages. Women were also taught some of the more mechanical, practical sides of infrastructure maintenance. As you can see there, the construction of tippy taps. They were trained in the development of a wash audit, the development of a household wash plan, the development of community water improvement plan, and the women were also trained in the solar disinfection of drinking water. Next slide, please. So again, I come back to a nighttime picture. These are the women that were given their certificates after they'd been trained in the solar disinfection of drinking water. As I said, they've got a full day. They have a lot of work to do during the day. So they were trained at nighttime. And they're quite happy. And they got their certificates at night. They'd done it. But I just feel like the important point was made by a village elder, and I'll quote from here. He said, "I can confidently say that women are responsible, they can serve as managers, and even become a chairperson for any organization or institution like we have. It can be managed by women." So a total change in mindset. And sometimes I think success is better measured not by the physical infrastructure that's installed in these places. Okay, so there were 33 water tanks installed, but it's really the change in mindset, because that can be perpetuated for generations to come. That is the biggest success. Next slide, please. So this is my village. We're on the banks of the Singatoka River. The two largest river systems in Fiji are the Rewa River and the Singatoka River. So Lawai, next slide, please. The women in Lawai are potteries. They are known for pottery. And so the slide is showing some of the wares that the women from my village make. They're well known for that. The next slide, please. I just wanted to compare and contrast villages between Nadula and Lawai. So I've said about the difference in water source. I've said about the difference in activity of water committees. In the maritime zone, where they are more water stressed, water committees function very effectively. Lawai, we're in 2 kilometers from a municipal town, Singatoka. It's a tourism hub. We have piped water supply by the Water Authority of Fiji. So the water committee doesn't function as effectively as it does in the maritime zone. Health committee, very active again in the maritime zone, almost inactive in my village. The female empowerment was really interesting. In Nadula, maritime zone, the conclusion was that female empowerment can come through water use and management, because the women rose to the occasion. They showed that they could do the maintenance checks on the physical infrastructure. They showed how they could take the lead on these committees. With Lawai, the women earn more money than the men, because they are employed at the ginger processing factory a few kilometers up the Valley Road, and they make revenue from the pottery. So the power dynamic in our village is quite different, where the women are earning, and the men actually do the school runs and everything else that women normally do in perhaps more Western countries. But I just thought I'd end on that note and hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Sobey, and we do appreciate that these are very complex presentations to give in 7 minutes, but we have so many good examples that we wanted to share with you. So we have time now for a couple of questions from the room and online. Do we have any questions, comments from the room first? You can raise your hand and introduce yourself. We might then, we might then go to Fraser online. Fraser, do you have any questions online?
question for Milika, Dr. Milika, and that's about scalability. And so a question, when you look at the interventions in the two different communities, what do you see as the scalability of these interventions, and what would be the key challenges in scaling to other communities?
That's a good question, Fraser. You know, the Vanua plays an important role no matter which village you go to in Fiji. It's just that in some places the structures are a lot more, how shall you put it, more intact than in other villages. With the WASH system, my first take-home message to my people back at home would be, you really need to pay attention to those WASH services, because we have tourists coming every day to the village to look at the pottery being made. The tourists need to be comfortable in using the sanitation facilities that are in the village. That was one of the key messages I'd like to actually, and in fact, I've actually told them. But it is easy to do, because no matter where you go, no matter how close you are to an urban center or whatever, those structures are still intact in terms of leadership structures in the village. And it's just a matter of working with, some women groups are more active than others. It's really just finding the right entry point with which, you know, finding out whom you're going to work with. Does that answer your question, Fraser?
I think that's an excellent start. Anyway, there's a lot more to unpack, I'm sure, but I think that's a great start. Thank you.
Thank you.
Question here. I'm not sure, Dr. Milika and Ruhil, if you're near the stage. Question to all the panelists so far around interventions have all mentioned training of women. And what do you think could be improved within the school system or education systems to avoid an ongoing reliance on project-based training for women? Would that relate to things like entrepreneurial skills, roles in water? You know, where could we look beyond the WASH system to be addressing these some of these underlying issues?
Yeah, I could say a few words and then hand over to you. I think that's a very good question, and I haven't thought of it that way. But something that we see directly with our work, where it connects even now, is getting young girls to stay in school. And a lot of that has to do with availability of time and opportunity and sanitation and in schools. So keeping young girls there, but then also what Rana said about including young boys and men within thinking around how women can feel and young girls can feel more empowered and more in control and feel like they have a choice more than needing to be told that they have a choice. I think it could start from there. So it's more structural. I think the education system, when you think about sort of gender interventions, I think a school system would be more structural, addressing larger norms and conditions that sort of operate to frame the options that women have. Whereas in the WASH system, we're going on the complete opposite end. We're looking at individual action and how we can enable individual or household action to get women making certain choices. So I think we're coming at it from very different angles. But yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
I think the only thing I'd add to that, Fraser, is that the Ministry of Education in Fiji is actually dealing with some of the more sensitive topics and bringing it into the curriculum, like menstrual health, because these things aren't actually openly discussed in a village setting, but also a lot of the teaching, a lot of the positive impacts can be done through the church, to be honest, because it's held in such high regard. If the church is actively involved in teaching how women should be respected and treated, then people will sit and listen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Rana, did you want to also add something?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, just words here, I guess. ID doesn't work too closely with the school systems. However, when it comes to sustainability, I guess working with local authorities who are women who are kind of having that mandate in rural Cambodia to support WASH systems and in their own communities at that subnational level. By providing them with those resources and again that kind of training of trainer and disseminating points, they are the ones going and providing some teachings and learnings to those schools themselves. So when we talk about the disseminating those messages to the community, schools are one of the ways or the platforms that we've seen those local authorities use to be able to disseminate these messages a bit more broadly, and use them as, again, those key points, including not church, but in this case, a pagoda is another kind of a Buddhist temple that is used as a way to disseminate some of these things more broadly. So using, again, someone who's already in charge that has that mandate to support WASH systems and kind of use them to be able to engage with a lot of these other stakeholders that are very important, but maybe they don't have as much of that responsibility or accountability yet, is kind of how we see it as well. Thanks.
Rana. So I can see there's a few hands raised here in the room, but what we might do is stay with the Pacific, listen to the next presentation from the Solomon Islands, and then we'll move to Australia for some presentations on Indigenous knowledge and climate resilient WASH. And then the people with the questions in the room can then ask their questions after this one. So next up, thank you very much, Tema Wickham from Solomon Islands.
Hello, Olketa. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Tema Wickham. I am a WASH practitioner, so I work for Plan International Pacific in the Solomon Islands, and I currently manage the Water for Women WASH project in the country. So we work mainly in rural communities. So the work I will present is a practice-led research. It was made possible through a collaboration and a partnership between Plan International Solomon Islands, Plan Australia, International Water Centre, Solomon Islands National University, Live and Learn Solomon Islands, and Earth Water People. Before I dive into this slide, just to give a bit of a context. So in Solomon Islands, there's a population of more than 600,000 people, and 80% live in rural and remote communities. So there are in the communities, there are shared water systems, and the rural water services are managed by the community with limited support from external actors. Communities have responsibility for planning and managing the water systems. So there are WASH committees that are established and formed to manage and operate the systems. However, there are a few key challenges that are faced. The community is still not prepared for problems caused by climate change and other changes. Women and youths are rarely consulted about water management issues. There's lack of diversity in the water committee groups, where age and gender, so there's more male, it's more male dominated, and so there's poor representation to amplify women and youth voices. And also at the catchment level, so when you're looking at communities that live next to each other, the relationships and the dialogue between the communities are also poor. So what action was taken? The There are a few approaches that were developed and implemented to strengthen community engagement in water management. So there is the community-based water security improvement planning tool. This is a process that engages community at the zone level. Community members are more stronger, have more stronger social and kinship connections at the zone level rather than the community level, so it's easy to make actions towards the water problems. There's also a second cycle of the CWC tool that was developed, and now it ensures diversity of participations, and it considers climate change and other changes. So now there is more inclusion of key influential people, for instance, like landowners, from church-based groups, representatives, and chiefs who have more influence on community priorities. Also, a photo voice was developed and tested. So it is an approach to facilitate intergenerational dialogue, so between the young women and the elders in the community, and also dialogue within and between communities around the water catchment management. So as a result of the approaches that were developed and implemented, there are a few clear evidences. So there's increase in knowledge, especially in regards to understanding the importance of water and hazards to the water system. The community also took proactive actions to manage the risks and hazards. It also triggered cooperation and sense of responsibility to manage water systems. So communities take the action to, for instance, bury the exposed pipes, clean the water dams. And also there is a restructuring of WASH committees to involve more youth and women. So these are some of the outcomes that were positive outcomes from the approaches. So I'd like to also share some quotes. The first quote, I'd like to read it out. So this is a quote from a female participant where she said, "It has empowered many of us. We learn how to manage water and to keep our drinking water clean." So this is showing that the knowledge of women has, improved throughout this process. And also there's a quote from the Water Committee chairman where he said that what is important and that I like most is the involvement of youths who are now becoming influential on the matter of water management and adaptation. So this is very important, where youths are being involved in the water committees, and their voices get to be heard. So finally, to conclude, there are a few key lessons from the key lessons and messages that I'd like to leave. So participatory approaches are very important. So it contributes to changes in power over WASH decision making. Diverse representation in WASH committees is one way to improve catchment level relationships and strengthen dialogue, so between the youths and the elderly. And also very important to find safe spaces that is comfortable for everyone. So for instance, we have separate discussion sessions for the women, which is involving them and providing a safe space for them to speak out and contribute. Also engaging different members of the community, so by that including church representatives, women, men, youths, zone leaders. It all attempts to engage everybody in the community, but also those in the neighboring communities. And yeah, so throughout this process, it also gives the opportunity to consult others who are not present in the sessions. But consultations outside of the activities also gather other views from people like people with disability, single mothers. So having that consultation is also important in such conversations. Yes, so thank you so much, everybody, for your time and for listening.
Thank you so much, Tema. And unless it might not be obvious, but a lot of our panellists have travelled from the complete opposite side of the planet, so they're doing so well with jet lag and everything to present these very complex stories. So you're in for a treat now. We have Michelle Hobbs from Griffith University, Australia, who will talk about system strengthening from the perspective of freshwater mussels.
Morning everyone. I'd like to acknowledge the Sami people and their care of these lands and waters over many thousands of years, and I'd also like to acknowledge my own ancestors. So I'm a freshwater ecologist. I'm also an Aboriginal woman. I'm a descendant of Bidra on my grandmother's side and Dungari on my grandfather's side. So my entry point to WASH is more from a catchment health and ecological point of view. When river health is good, there is less water treatment required and it's cheaper and easier. And healthy catchments are also really important for climate resilience. So just for a bit of quick an Australian context in terms of the environments, catchments vary a lot in Australia. It's a very big place. It's one of the most hydrologically variable places in the world. So some places are quite wet, like the picture on the right there, and other places are quite dry, and rivers only flow when you get large storm cells coming through. There's also a huge cultural diversity in Australia. In terms of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, there are more than 500 language groups across the continent, and each of those groups have their own cultural connections to their rivers and water places. Because of the huge dynamics in water availability in Australia, a lot of the rivers are very strictly managed in terms of water licensing, and I'll talk a bit about how that can affect ecosystems as well. Oh, yeah, thank you. So I work on freshwater mussels. They're not necessarily the be-all and end-all of river health, but they are very important. They're effectively the kidneys of the river system. They are large filter feeders, so they spend all their time taking all the algae and bacteria out of the water and settling it onto the bottom. So they're really important in maintaining water quality. They also increase productivity in the river systems in terms of other organisms. However, in terms of the way that rivers are managed, freshwater mussels are a bit of a blind spot. When you look at conservation and the way that rivers are managed, there is often a focus on a really narrow set of indicators. Fish are a big research focus, pretty much because they're more obvious and more charismatic, and they have cute faces, unlike mussels. So for me, mussels are an example how the current approaches to river management are not particularly holistic and not particularly inclusive either. Aboriginal people are well aware of how important mussels are for river ecosystems, and they're often on our radars. In the old days, women would gather mussels and cook them up for the kids and the family, so it's a really important source of food. Up north, a lot of people still eat freshwater mussels. In the more developed catchments and areas, mussels are no longer eaten quite so much because there's a lot of concerns about contamination from industry and from agricultural chemicals. All the mussels have simply disappeared. Mussels are one of the most threatened groups of animals in the world, and their populations are seriously declining. Freshwater mussels are also a really important material that you find in sacred middens around the country. So a midden is a deposit of leftover cooking materials from thousands of generations of people returning to the same area to cook in those places. So they have a lot of cultural significance as well. Next slide, please. So at the end of the last drought, we had an absolutely apocalyptic drought, which culminated in these conditions at the end of 2019-2020. That was also the summer of what we call the Black bushfires, when most of the country caught on fire. It was a pretty scary time. So the drought conditions that you see here are because of that hydrological drought, which is partly to do with climate change, partly just a really severe drought, just a lack of rain. But another contributing factor was over-allocation of water, particularly allowing the extraction of water for irrigation during low flow conditions in the river. Historically, the Darling River that we're looking at here has a long history of having a lot of times of very low flow, but very few times has the river actually dried up to this extent. It's actually quite rare. And a study showed that the conditions that we saw at the end of the drought with the level of water extraction that occurred, brought forward these conditions by about 3 years. So had that been managed more conservatively, we might have made it a bit further along until the rains came back. So there was a lot of publicity at the time with fish kills at this time. It was all over the media, but there was not a lot about freshwater mussels. But Aboriginal people were quite vocal about the loss of absolutely thousands and thousands of mussels in the river. So this led to a scientific survey that I was on the team with that, and we went and surveyed the dead mussels and surveyed the damage. There was more than 95% mortality of mussels in most of the river and more than 95% in many areas, particularly the Lower Darling. So this is going to take decades for the river to recover from this. Mussels are relatively slow growing. They take about 4 years to mature, and they have a very complex life cycle where they attach to fish. So they need the fish to come back first before their populations can recover. So it will take many decades for the mussels to recover. So by continually keeping the Darling in this state of low or no flow, with its natural wetlands dry, we have really reduced its ability to cope with extended drought. And one of the reasons for this is that water has been separated from the land in the way that it has been managed, and this happens in a legislative context, in a policy context. The water is essentially turned into a commodity, and the river is no longer treated as a being or a river. The water is separated, and often all the water is stored in off-river storages rather than actually being in the river, where it can enable the river to do what it does. So in Australia, many more catchments are in danger of being developed in this way, particularly up north, where there is quite a lot of water available in the tropics. However, once you start installing dams and taking the water in these off-river storages, then the river is no longer able to sustain these aquatic ecosystems which support ecosystem health and enable us to adapt to climate change. So to weave this into a conservation context, a lot of this management has traditionally been driven by male-dominated. Water is a very male-dominated industry. There's relatively few women working in water management and few in water research as well, and very few Aboriginal women as well. So it's really important that Indigenous voices are included in this context and are considered experts. We know how our rivers are supposed to function. We understand the relationships between all the different organisms and the water and how they operate. So it's really important to consider those perspectives when it comes to making policy decisions and also driving research questions. Next slide, please. So out of this research, we discovered that low flows are really critically important to rivers, particularly in these low rainfall environments. And also out of this work, I was able to participate in a program called the Native Fish Recovery Strategy for the Murray-Darling Basin. I was able to, because I was there and because of my interest in freshwater mussels and my perspectives as an Aboriginal woman, I was able to advocate for the inclusion of shellfish and also crayfish in these plans, which would otherwise have just been focused on fish. So for me personally, that was a huge win. So it's really important to have diverse voices in catchment management, and it's also a human right of Indigenous people. And I'd just like to leave you with this quote from the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People: to maintain and strengthen their distinctive spiritual relationship with their traditionally owned or otherwise occupied and used lands, territories, waters and coastal seas and other resources, and to uphold their responsibilities for future generations in this regard. So it's not just a matter of Indigenous knowledges and getting the best outcomes for the river, it's also a human right and our responsibility to future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle, for sharing that story with us, which I think you'll all agree was a pretty, in a way, very violent story about the ecology of those rivers being destroyed and that it will take decades to recover. But thankfully, with Indigenous knowledge and a systems approach, we know now who we need to listen to to make that happen. So in continuing with our theme of Indigenous expertise, I would like to welcome to the stage Professor Phil Duncan from the University of Canberra. Welcome, Phil.
Yama, Phil Duncan Naya, Gomeroi Māori. That's hello, welcome. My name's Phil Duncan. I'm a very proud Gomeroi, Gamilaroi man. I too want to acknowledge the Sami people whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land on which we gather on today, and had the most wonderful experience with the Sami yesterday. Two-way knowledge exchanges. I want to reaffirm what Michelle was talking about, the decoupling, the legislative process of decoupling land from water, which really does not fit well with our cultural way of life, our cultural way of living, our symbiotic relationship with country. And, it's important that we look at the integration of cultural science, our methodologies into these practices. And I applaud you, Michelle, for the work that you've done with the native fish recovery strategy and empowering and creating a safe space for women. And having said that, I am very proud to stand before you as a man, to stand with and for women and the rematriation of women's knowledge globally into the water debate, into the capacity building and strengthening and resilience of communities that don't necessarily have the necessary infrastructure. This image, I want to pay homage to Jason Wilson. Very proud Ularoi and Gamilaroi man. And it's Bulima, the sky stories. And these stories have come down from our women, our mothers. I am my mother's son, and today I honour my mother and many mothers around this world and those that are in this room with us. It's so important that we seize this day and seize this moment. In Australia, we've got 500 communities across that country, this wonderful affluent country called Australia, that do not have any infrastructure. WASH. And it is a health issue, closing the gap. And I believe that our women's centrality to our families, to our community, to our education, we need to create those safe environments where they can have the necessary courageous conversations to help guide us. And I want men that are not just in this room, but those that are online and globally, to think about how we are our mother's sons. We should never forget that. And how we can assist providing stronger platforms for our women. And there's nothing wrong with taking a step back and walking behind our women and empowering them. Our communities, with our women's gravitation into leadership roles, particularly in the health arena, shines a significant spotlight on the messages they bring about how our women's knowledge. We are a matriarchal society in Australia. I think that we are a matriarchal society from an Indigenous perspective globally. And yes, in Australia, it is very male-dominated, the water debates. I want to also say a quick couple of key messages about, and I'm going to be quite forthright about us men using our head and our hearts and our hands. Our knowledge and our hearts of our women, our mothers, and how we can unite with our hands to support that journey. To create that safe pathway for our women to rise and to lead us. Not just in Australia, but I believe we could do that globally with these two-way knowledge exchanges and supporting our women to guide, guiding us into the future. So basically my key message to this today is, Jason's stories about Bullima. That's my mother, the dinner one that lives in the Milky Way. And this man has been entrusted with our stories from his mother and many mothers. And that's our on-country classroom, Winangali Ganamagali. Listen, learn, understand from our sacred Mother Earth about our water. So I want to leave you with two things. Water for women, excuse me. Thank you for walking with our women, not just in Australia but globally. And a challenge to us men is to stop the lateral violence and assist and use our voices to diminish and mitigate the lateral violence, bullying and intimidation of our women, not just where we live but globally, and stand united. And today I honour my mother and many mothers around this globe. Yene.
Thank you, Phil. You always do such an amazing job of encapsulating all of these complex messages. And this wasn't the slide that we were going to end on, actually, but Phil had it on his telephone, and we just thought, can we use that slide, Phil? Because it really shows the complexity, the need to listen and understand if we're going to take a systems approach, that we're all on a learning journey, and that the systems are complex, but if we work together and listen and understand, we can really solve these big problems that are facing us all. So this brings us to the end of our speakers today. I know we had some questions in the room, so please put your hand up, and we have someone with a mic who can come around, introduce yourself, and then we'll have the panellists come up and answer your questions. Thank you. To you, please. Oh, where's the mic? Oh, sorry. Can we have the mic on, please?
Yes, hello. Yeah. Thank you for the presentations. Very inspiring. My name is Ioannis Georgiadis. I'm a humanitarian aid worker and working with the Norwegian Church Aid, and we work in mostly in emergencies and humanitarian contexts, and we also work together with my colleague. I'm a WASH advisor, and work together with other programs we have is also within gender-based violence. So we try to work together in emergencies. And during emergencies, in emergency context, we see that people tend to go back to pre-existing, let's say, gender dynamics or patriarchal norms. And it is a bit, I want to ask the presenters to see how, for example, in this, what you presented, for example, how this transformation can live through or go through when there is like an emergency event or like a shock in the system, or how this resilience or how this, let's say, is built in this transformation, how this can stay on during an emergency when, you know, systems collapse and all this work is being kind of challenged. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, that's an excellent question. Yes, I think Dr. Malika Sobey will be the person to answer that one. Thank you for that question.
Thank you for the question. I was relating it to COVID-19 when everything shut down. In Fiji, we had this movement start called Barter for Better Fiji. It was started by women, and it wasn't innovative in the sense that bartering was new. It was something that was done in the past. But the thought of going back to that was innovative. They said, let's do it again, because so many people, our tourism industry, we're very dependent on tourism. Our tourism industry virtually collapsed. There were more than 100,000 people left unemployed. And so bartering was done with goods and services, no cash exchanged at all. That was led by women. Now, for that maritime island that I showed you, Nadula Island, there's an amazing woman leader there who went back. She said, I was so concerned about how these families were going to feed themselves. So she actually took the time to basically rally the troops. That island is very well known for their fish, bountiful fish stocks. So she got them to catch fish, she got coconuts done, and she bartered the fish and the coconuts with people that were living in the urban centers, which were then distributed to all the different villages there. Just, flour, sugar, that sort of stuff. So women took the lead during that COVID-19 crisis when everything shut down and cash was so hard to come by. Does that answer your question?
Okay, we have one more question in the back of the room here.
Hi there, my name's Jenna Hegarty. I'm here on behalf of the Working Animal Alliance. What really struck me from all the speakers was the importance of really understanding the local context, including but not restricted to the human actors involved. And I'd love to know if there were any kind of key dependencies highlighted by the communities that the speakers have worked with, including but not restricted to the role of working animals in WASH systems, and whether that's changing as the climate changes as well. Thank you.
Thank you for that. It's a very interesting question, and also how we started thinking about climate impacts on sanitation and hygiene, because it's not just an event that happens externally, it's also how people respond and react and build those relationships. What we saw in Bangladesh was the occupation in the area was a lot around, more around agriculture and animal rearing, but with the intrusion of salinity, people started farming shrimp because shrimp farming is done in saline water, and it was quite lucrative. But what that also meant was it started a sort of cycle of increasing salinity, more shrimp farming, also increasing the salinity. And so now that cycle has begun, but then, and it's only about 7 to 10 years old. Doesn't go back very far. But that is causing all of these new problems for women, but then also it is lucrative, so families continue to do it because what is also happening is the water level is rising in the ward, and there's lots of fear that their home is not going to exist in about 10-20 years, so they feel the need to earn as much as they can to continue to stave off a lot of the pressure. So yeah, the decisions and the framework in which people are making these decisions is changing, which also means it's creating new interactions with the environment around them.
Hi, I'm Michael Wilson from the Australian Water Partnership, which is alongside Water for Women, the other flagship Australian Water for Development program funded by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. What came through for me in the presentations was the sense that when one is actively working to change the power and influence dynamic towards women or towards First Nations voices, that load can very easily fall on very few sets of shoulders. So maybe, I don't know, Malika and Michelle or Phil, how do you do that in a way that avoids burning out your key leaders in your communities?
That's an excellent question, and it's still one that we're looking for answers for. I think it's important to look at the long-term pipeline and make sure that we've got more people coming through, whether it's university or other programs, so that we've got more people to rely on. And it's also important to be supporting the people that we have got and making sure that those support systems are equitable and just giving people what they need to stay connected to both communities and in the workforce, because it is a complicated role. Phil, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, Marabou, Michael, yes, good question. And yes, Michelle's right. It's we're on a journey, and I believe that the journey needs to be led by our women. It needs to be designed by our women, and it needs to be resourced effectively to bring about change. It's not going to be easy, but if we look at the future through the lens of our kids and the type of society and communities we want them to grow into, women's centrality to that is important, and we just need to walk with them. And for me, I call out to men to take the step in the right direction, for us to, get out of the way. I know these are bold statements, but, from success, we need to clear the road for them, for our women, our yinners, that's what we call our Aboriginal women in Gamilaroi. Yeah, so it's not going to be easy, but together we can make a difference.
Can I just add that, particularly in an Australian context, I'm not sure how this works internationally, but within an Australian context, it's really important for organisations to take steps to educate all of their staff in cultural capability training, because that takes a massive load off Indigenous staff for having to explain themselves again and again and be the person that responds to all the Indigenous requests that come across their desk. That's really important.
I have to concur with Phil and Michelle. It'll take time, Michael. I think it's very important to mentor young people that are coming through. We have some wonderful young women that are in the community that are very keen to get involved. And I think the older ones, like myself, need to really take the time to mentor these younger people. And if they're Indigenous, it actually makes it easier, because they're already aware of the cultural context, and they will work within the system that's already there. But yeah, I would say mentoring. Thank you.
Okay, and we have one final question, because I've been told that we can't run over time because there's another session starting. So one final question and then concluding remarks.
Okay, thank you. My name is Margot Boerk. I'm from Plan International Nederland. And we've been working on the WASH SDG program for the past 5 to 6 years, supported by the Dutch government. Anyway, I'm just really interesting hearing all this and many different kind of contributions. And my question is not very specific, but mostly in general, precisely because it are very beautiful work and examples. I'm wondering, and many of them I recognize because it resonates also what we do within WASH SDG program, which is about gender transformative WASH and social inclusion. And my question, because many of the examples that were given here, for me it's not, it would be really great to have like the scope and the timeline, because if we talk about achieving gender transformation or social inclusion within WASH, it really takes a lot of time. It does not happen overnight. So I'm wondering, and we will not be able to answer this now, but I think it's so important to really package all these great examples and also to see how we can sell that to the outside world, because I feel, I don't know, maybe in this audience we have many people from NGOs and government and I don't know, maybe but how can we sell all this and showcase it to also other kind of donors and financing institutions to go and join this all these efforts, because I think that also is maybe a challenge. I mean, it's not a discussion of today in this session, but it's really key. And yeah, that's maybe a question and also a reflection.
Hello? Yes, it's a really great comment. On behalf of Water for Women, I can say that we have a lot of tools available to scale up these approaches. You can use the QR codes or come and visit us at our booth, which is downstairs in the centre of the big room, or speak to us or any of our partners, and we will be more than happy to share all of the tools and information that we've developed over the 6 years of the fund, working in 16, 17 different countries in Asia Pacific, because a lot of them are proven, actionable tools that have impacts. Now, we have 3 minutes, and I would like to invite to the stage for the final closing remarks Llewellyn Martin, who's speaking on behalf of the Australian government here, and she will provide some comments and key messages. And I'd just like to thank you on behalf of Water for Women and all of our friends for attending this session, and we hope to see you downstairs at the booth. So thank you. Llewellyn.
Thanks, Zara. Wow, 3 minutes. There's a lot to cover from this session. So my name's Llewellyn Martin. I work for the Australian Government Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water. And I'm a Cooma Kamilaroi woman from Australia's First Nations, and I would also like to pay my respect to the Sami and express my deep appreciation for their hospitality and having us on their traditional lands. So I guess just to try and give a bit of a quick recap of what we've covered in this session, I think we started sort of conceptually talking about WASH systems, and that a WASH system is a network of people and institutions, and it's defined by their interrelationships, but what's important about that is where the power sits within those systems. We talked about the benefits of diverse systems and how diverse systems are strong systems, and how by incorporating the voices of women, of First Nations people and of people with diverse lived experiences, we get not only different perspectives and networks and pathways to change, we get more equitable WASH services. And I think Ruhil did a really good job of illustrating this with her case study, where we saw that by conducting participatory consultations, she was able, through this work, they were able to identify the impacts of storm surges and saltwater intrusion, as well as the associated health impacts for women. We also learned in terms of the value of diverse systems about the value that Indigenous water experts and knowledge holders and cultural leaders bring, deep spiritual connections to water and country, and important cultural science about climate impacts and solutions. And it's critical to bring their voice and knowledge and expertise to the centre of water and WASH systems for all of our benefit, really. And I think it was a really neat example from Michelle about how, by valuing Indigenous knowledge and perspectives, by valuing freshwater mussels more, we have available to us all a more holistic approach to water management. And I think, Phil, was a great challenge that you issued to everyone, really, to sort of tap into culture and wisdom to bring forth women's voices. And I also just want to acknowledge, in talking about sort of bringing forward women's voices in a sort of, well, I want to acknowledge the work of Professor Bradley Mogridge here at the back, and his work about rematriating water, which is an important contribution in this context. Going back to our sort of conceptual framework, we talked about what types of change need to be affected within a WASH system to empower diverse voices. And we learned that there are structural and practical changes that we can make, there's relational and political changes that we can make, and importantly, there's mental and attitudinal change that we need to seek to effect as well. And just, I think we saw that really clearly in a few of the case studies as well, about successes in shifting that power. So Rana in Cambodia told us how she or the work that she did in investing in capacity and capability of women sanitation authorities and entrepreneurs led to better sanitation and resilience outcomes for communities there. And similarly, in Fiji, Milika told us about the training that was delivered there, appropriate to the local context by training women at night when they had the time to participate. So not only did women's numbers in water committees increase, but the positions of power that they held within those committees also increased, leading to better outcomes and changes in mindset over the longer term. And then finally, it was really interesting to hear, Tema, your work in the Solomon Islands and those innovative tools that you've developed to affect change. The community-based water security improvement planning tool and your photo voice tool, really innovative ways to bring diverse voices to the water committees in the Solomon Islands. So finally, then I think it's, I guess just perhaps a final point to reflect on. So how as, organisations and individuals working within water and WASH systems, what can we do to influence more inclusive and climate resilient WASH systems? And I think it's a really important point to reflect on that, that we need to demonstrate inclusive and participatory practices in our own organisations as well and build diverse collaborations, because I think what we all know is that our organisations will never be as effective as they could be unless they include individuals from the communities that we serve and that we're able to bring in those diverse voices as well. Thank you.